She was a princess of Russia, known for her charm, youth, and beauty. Yet by the age of 17, Anastasia Romanov vanished into history, leaving a mystery that would captivate the world for decades. How could a royal simply disappear? Without a trace, Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanova was born on June 18, 1901, into the grandeur of the Russian imperial family. She was the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna, heirs to the Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. The young princess grew up amidst opulent palaces, vast estates, and a life of ceremonial splendor. Yet beneath the surface of wealth and privilege, political unrest simmered, threatening to engulf the imperial household. From her earliest years, Anastasia's life was defined by contrasts. She experienced the grandeur of royal protocol and the intimacy of family life. Nurtured by loving parents and close relationships with her siblings, she was playful, curious, and spirited, often described by contemporaries as lively and mischievous qualities that endeared her to those around her and provided a semblance of normalcy amid the rigid rules of imperial life. Her days were filled with lessons in languages, music, and etiquette, preparing her for the responsibilities that came with royalty, even as her youth allowed for moments of carefree joy. Yet the backdrop to her upbringing was one of escalating tension in Russia. The empire faced political instability, economic hardship, and social unrest. Revolutionary sentiment was growing, fueled by dissatisfaction with autocratic rule, widespread poverty, and the failures of World War I. Within this volatile climate, the Romanov family, despite their wealth and ceremonial authority, became increasingly isolated. The young Anastasia grew up in a world where the opulence of her surroundings was overshadowed by the fragility of her dynasty. In 1917, these tensions culminated in the Russian Revolution, a moment that would alter the course of Anastasia's life forever. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, and the imperial family was placed under house arrest. The young princess, once insulated by luxury, suddenly found herself confined, monitored, and surrounded by uncertainty. Palaces became prisons, and the trappings of royalty could no longer shield her from the political upheaval that had transformed her world. During the months of captivity, Anastasia's life was a mixture of strict supervision and fleeting attempts at normalcy. She and her siblings were allowed to continue small routines, such as lessons and walks within restricted grounds, but always under the watchful eyes of guards. Letters, correspondence, and diaries suggest that she retained a sense of humor and resilience, finding solace in small games and interactions with family. Yet the ever-present threat of revolution and violence loomed, a shadow over the fragile routines of their confined existence. As the Bolsheviks consolidated power, the fate of the Romanovs became increasingly uncertain. Rumors circulated regarding their potential exile, execution, or rescue. For Anastasia, these months were marked by fear, confusion, and the dawning realization that her once secure position as a princess no longer offered safety or influence. The young royal, raised in opulence, now navigated a world defined by uncertainty, espionage, and political maneuvering that she could neither fully understand nor control. Then came the fateful night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, when Anastasia and her family were executed in the cellar of the Epatev house in Yekaterinburg. Contemporary accounts describe the brutality of the event, the chaos of the execution, and the attempts of some family members to survive. Amid the horror, stories emerged that Anastasia might have escaped a narrative that would capture imaginations. Worldwide, eyewitness accounts were incomplete, bodies were initially misidentified, and rumors flourished, giving rise to the legend of the vanished princess. The mystery of Anastasia's possible survival was compounded by the political and social chaos of post-revolutionary Russia. Information was tightly controlled, bodies were disposed of hastily, and the new regime sought to eliminate symbols of the old order. This environment allowed myths to take hold, fueling decades of speculation and imposter claims from women purporting to be the lost princess. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and Anastasia's story evolved into a legend as much as a historical event. Anastasia's disappearance, whether factual or legendary, illustrates the fragility of life and power during periods of upheaval. A young royal, once surrounded by luxury and influence, vanished from public life, leaving a void that inspired intrigue, hope, and a fascination that transcended generations. Her story reminds us that historical events are not always neatly resolved and that individuals, even those born into immense privilege, can vanish into the shadows of history. And so, as we consider the fate of the young Romanov princess, one question lingers, unresolved and haunting. Could a princess, a symbol of an entire empire, truly vanish without a trace, leaving the world to wonder whether she lived beyond the cellar walls of Yekaterinburg? Even after the sounds of gunfire faded in Yekaterinburg, whispers began to spread. Had Anastasia really perished with her family, or had she slipped through the chaos, vanishing into the shadows of a Russia in turmoil? In the months leading up to the execution, Anastasia's life was marked by increasing confinement and psychological strain. The family was moved to the Ipatiev house, a nondescript building in Yekaterinburg selected by the Bolsheviks for its security and secrecy. Rooms that had once been used for leisure became cells. Corridors were patrolled constantly, and windows were covered to prevent observation. For Anastasia, the transition from imperial palaces to this hidden prison was dramatic. The contrast between the freedom of her childhood and the strictures of captivity was stark, shaping the young princess's understanding of the fragility of her position. Life in the Ipatiev house involved routines that provided minimal comfort but preserved a semblance of normalcy. The family was allowed small walks, quiet lessons, and occasional conversations with attendants, all under the vigilant supervision of guards loyal to the revolutionary government. Despite the monotony, Anastasia maintained a playful spirit. Letters and memoirs from attendants recount moments of humor and mischief. Games played quietly in corners, teasing exchanges with siblings, and the small acts of defiance that reminded her of her humanity amid the tension. Yet, tension in the house grew daily. The political situation outside was deteriorating, and the Bolsheviks feared that loyalist forces might attempt to rescue. The imperial family's continued presence represented both a threat and a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionaries. These fears, combined with the young ages of the Romanov children, created a volatile environment in which the family's fate was increasingly uncertain. Guards and officials debated what should be done, and plans for a final resolution were quietly formulated. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, these plans culminated in tragedy. Anastasia, along with her parents, siblings, and attendants, was executed in the basement of the Ipatiev house. The circumstances were chaotic. Reports indicate that some family members were able to momentarily resist, escape initial gunfire, or survive bursts of gunfire, creating confusion among both the executioners and potential witnesses. In the darkness and panic, identification of bodies became difficult, leaving space for uncertainty to creep in. It was this confusion that fueled the legend of Anastasia's survival. Early rumors suggested that one of the daughters, possibly Anastasia, had survived the massacre. Witnesses claimed to have seen a young woman in different parts of Russia, living under assumed identities. Letters, sightings, and reports circulated, each adding layers of speculation and intrigue. Some were likely mistaken, others intentional fabrications. But the effect was profound. The idea that Anastasia had vanished from history began to take root. The legend spread quickly, aided by the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia and the lack of reliable information in Europe. Emigres from the Russian aristocracy clung to the hope that a member of the Romanov family had survived. Newspapers reported sightings, mysterious letters arrived in royal circles, and stories of imposters claiming the identity of Anastasia proliferated. Each claim, whether credible or fraudulent, reinforced the notion that she had escaped, feeding the imagination of the public and creating a mystery that persisted for decades. Among the most famous of these claimants was Anna Anderson, who emerged in the 1920s, asserting that she was the lost princess. Her story captivated Europe and the United States alike. Anderson's claims were supported by certain mannerisms, knowledge of court life, and personal anecdotes, though they were also fiercely disputed. The debate over her identity became a cultural phenomenon, blending history, legend, and popular fascination. For many, the idea that Anastasia had vanished remained plausible, even romantic, a symbol of survival against impossible odds, even outside of imposters and rumors. Anastasia's story became a lens through which people explored the fragility of monarchy and the vulnerability of those born into privilege. She was a princess who had experienced every comfort and right of birth, only to have it stripped away suddenly and violently. Her disappearance represented not only personal tragedy, but also the collapse of an entire political order. In this sense, her vanishing resonated beyond mere curiosity. It symbolized the sweeping forces of history that could erase even the most elevated lives. The persistence of the Anastasia myth also illustrates the human need for hope and narrative closure. In the face of political chaos and mass executions, stories of survival provided a psychological balm, a way to imagine continuity where history had imposed finality. Even as investigators and officials attempted to confirm the deaths, the legend refused to die at each new claim. Each alleged sighting reinforced the idea that Anastasia had transcended death, if only in memory and imagination. And so, as the legend of Anastasia took root, a critical question emerged, one that would endure for nearly a century. Was the young princess truly executed in Yekaterinburg, or did she somehow survive, vanishing into obscurity while the world debated her fate? Imagine inheriting the crown of one of the world's most powerful empires, only to give it up for love. Edward VIII did exactly that, shocking Britain and the world, and forever changing the course of the monarchy. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, later known as King Edward VIII, was born on June 23, 1894, into the heart of British royalty. The eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary, Edward's childhood was steeped in privilege, ceremony, and the expectation of leadership from a young age. He was aware that his life was destined to revolve around duty, tradition, and the pressures of a crown that extended across continents. Yet Edward's personality, charismatic, charming, and often rebellious, suggested that he might not fit neatly into the mold of a conventional monarch. Edward's formative years were marked by education designed to prepare him for kingship. Tutors instructed him in history, languages, politics, and the rituals of court life. He was groomed to understand not only the grandeur of monarchy, but also the responsibilities of governance, diplomacy, and public duty. Yet alongside this rigorous preparation, Edward displayed a strong inclination for social engagement, adventure, and the trappings of high society. He had a flair for style, a love of modern life, and a magnetic personality that drew both admiration and concern from his family and advisors. His early adulthood coincided with the upheavals of the First World War, during which he served in the British Army. Edward's military service was largely ceremonial, but it provided exposure to the broader realities of leadership, national morale, and public scrutiny. His role in the war further enhanced his public image, painting him as a young, gallant figure who represented hope and continuity for the empire in difficult times. Yet beneath the surface, Edward's personal interests and relationships began to complicate his suitability. As a traditional monarch, Edward's charisma and charm made him a figure of fascination, both within Britain and abroad. He cultivated friendships and romances that were often viewed as unconventional or controversial by the standards of royal expectation. This penchant for personal freedom clashed at times with the rigid protocols of monarchy. Advisors frequently cautioned him about appearances, propriety, and political implications. But Edward's desire for personal fulfillment often took precedence over traditional obligations. The most significant of these relationships, and the one that would ultimately define his reign, was with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. Wallis was a woman of sophistication, charm, and social poise, but her marital history created a profound constitutional crisis. In the 1930s, as Edward ascended the throne following his father's death in 1936, the prospect of marrying Wallis became a matter of national concern. The British government, the Church of England, and public opinion all weighed heavily on the decision, as royal marriage was not merely a private affair but a political and moral statement with implications across the empire. Edward's attachment to Wallis was deep and personal. Historical accounts describe a romance that transcended convention, fueled by mutual admiration, emotional intimacy, and a shared understanding of social sophistication. Yet the relationship created friction with political leaders who feared the destabilizing impact of a monarch marrying a divorced woman with living ex-spouses. The tension between Edward's personal desires and his constitutional duties became increasingly acute, bringing to the surface questions about the nature of monarchy, the limits of personal freedom, and the expectations placed on a sovereign. As the crisis intensified, Edward faced a stark choice: forsake his love to maintain the throne, or abdicate to follow his heart. The world watched as a monarch confronted the unprecedented scenario of prioritizing personal fulfillment over public duty. Advisors, family members, and politicians pleaded for compromise, warning of the constitutional, religious, and social ramifications of his decision. Yet Edward's resolve grew, reflecting a determination to define his life on his own terms rather than conforming to the rigid expectations of the monarchy. The months leading up to the abdication were filled with negotiation, tension, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Edward understood that choosing Wallis meant irrevocably altering the line of succession, disrupting centuries of royal tradition, and reshaping public perception of the monarchy. He also recognized the personal consequences: estrangement from family, loss of formal authority, and lifelong scrutiny from historians and the public alike. Yet for Edward, the possibility of living authentically with Wallis outweighed the burdens of power and precedent. And so, the stage was set for an event that would shock the world: the abdication of a reigning monarch. For the sake of love, Edward VIII, a man who had been groomed for a life of ceremonial authority, would soon make a choice that no king had made in modern British history. The implications of this decision would ripple across the empire, influence the trajectory of global politics, and forever alter the perception of monarchy as both a personal and political institution. Even as Edward contemplated his choice, one question lingered, unresolved and profound. How could a king, surrounded by duty, tradition, and expectation, willingly relinquish power for love, knowing that his decision would forever change history and the lives of millions under his rule? In the corridors of Buckingham Palace and the offices of Downing Street, whispers of scandal grew louder. A king in love was challenging centuries of tradition, and Britain was holding its breath. By 1936, Edward VIII had ascended the throne following the death of his father, King George V. The transition seemed seamless in ceremony, yet beneath the polished veneer of royal protocol, a storm was brewing. Edward's infatuation with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, had intensified. Their relationship, once discreet, now became impossible to conceal. Every glance, meeting, and social engagement fueled speculation, worry, and, ultimately, a constitutional crisis that gripped Britain. Edward's charm and confidence masked the enormity of the challenge he faced. Publicly, he was the embodiment of monarchy, composed, elegant, and seemingly devoted to duty. Privately, however, he confronted a tension between personal desire and public obligation. Marrying Wallis meant defying the expectations of the Church of England, whose doctrine opposed remarriage after divorce if the former spouse was still living. It also threatened the stability of the monarchy, potentially alienating ministers, parliament, and the people. The government of the United Kingdom, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, viewed Edward's intentions with grave concern. Baldwin warned that marriage to Wallis could provoke a constitutional crisis, as the king was head of the church and expected to uphold its teachings. Ministers feared public backlash, damage to Britain's image domestically and internationally, and a precedent that could undermine the monarchy's authority. Discussions between the king and Baldwin were tense, formal, and laden with warnings. Edward could not marry Wallis and remain king without creating turmoil. Edward, however, remained steadfast. He saw his love for Wallis as paramount, believing that personal happiness outweighed ceremonial expectation. Historical accounts suggest that he felt trapped between duty and passion, viewing abdication not as a failure, but as a conscious choice to define his life on his own terms. His commitment to Wallis was unwavering, even as political advisors, family members, and the public implored him to reconsider. The royal family itself reacted with a mixture of disbelief, disapproval, and sorrow. Queen Mary, Edward's mother, expressed concern about the implications for the crown and the empire. Edward's siblings, including the future George VI, recognized the unprecedented nature of the situation and the potential disruption it could cause. Family dinners, private discussions, and letters became arenas of negotiation and emotional appeals. Yet Edward's resolve only strengthened. Meanwhile, media attention intensified. Newspapers across Britain and Europe reported on the king's personal life, fueling gossip and speculation. Editorials debated morality, duty, and love, while the public became increasingly aware of the scandalous dimensions of the royal romance. Edward's behavior, once considered charming, was now scrutinized for its potential to destabilize centuries of tradition. The tension between personal freedom and public expectation became a defining feature of the crisis. In the months that followed, Edward weighed his options. Advisors explored alternative solutions: a morganatic marriage, exile, or postponement of marriage until political acceptance could be secured. None of these options satisfied Edward, who perceived them as compromises on his fundamental right to live authentically with the woman he loved. The crisis reached a climax as he understood that retaining the crown while marrying Wallis was impossible under the constitutional and religious framework of the United Kingdom. Finally, Edward made the historic decision. In December 1936, he prepared to abdicate, choosing love over throne and personal fulfillment over political expectation. The abdication process was meticulous. Edward drafted a letter addressed to his brother, George VI, formally renouncing the crown. He ensured that the transition would be smooth, instructing that his actions protect the monarchy's continuity even as he stepped away from duty. The act was unprecedented in modern British history, a reigning monarch voluntarily relinquishing power for personal reasons. The months leading to the abdication were filled with tension, secrecy, and emotion. Edward and Wallis remained at the center of attention. Yet the world could not fully comprehend the gravity of their choice. Historians later noted that Edward's decision reshaped not only the royal family, but also the perception of monarchy itself. A king had voluntarily abandoned authority, signaling that personal desire could, at least in rare circumstances, outweigh centuries of tradition and public expectation. And so, as Edward prepared to sign the abdication documents and step into the unknown, one question loomed, unresolved and haunting. Could a monarch truly give up the crown without altering the future of the monarchy forever? And what would be the cost, both personal and national, of choosing love over duty? On a December morning in 1936, a king chose love over a crown. The world watched as Edward VIII vanished from the throne, leaving behind duty, tradition, and a nation in stunned silence. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII formally abdicated the throne, signing the document that would remove him from power and pass the crown to his younger brother, Albert, Duke of York, who would become George VI. The abdication shocked the nation and the world. Newspapers carried headlines announcing the unprecedented act, a monarch stepping down voluntarily. not through revolution, death, or forced exile, but for the sake of personal love. The political, social, and emotional reverberations were immediate and profound. In Britain, the abdication prompted a mixture of outrage, bewilderment, and fascination. Loyalists lamented the loss of a king who could have shaped the empire's modern identity. Conservatives decried the personal nature of the decision, arguing that the crown was an institution, not a personal possession. Meanwhile, the public displayed a mixture of sympathy and intrigue. Edward's popularity, particularly among the younger and more cosmopolitan population, meant that many viewed his choice as romantic and courageous. Challenging centuries of strict protocol, the royal family faced the delicate task of maintaining stability amid scandal. Queen Mary and other senior members worked to reinforce the legitimacy of George VI's succession, emphasizing continuity, duty, and the monarchy's enduring strength. Behind the scenes, however, relationships were strained. Edward's decision was both a personal betrayal and a constitutional necessity. Family ties were tested as emotional bonds collided with the demands of monarchy. The careful choreography of public appearances, official announcements, and private councils sought to manage both perception and reality. Edward, now titled Duke of Windsor, married Wallis Simpson on June 3, 1937, in a private ceremony in France. The couple settled into exile, living in France and later the United States, far from the political stage Edward had once occupied. Their life together was marked by comfort, social prestige, and international attention, yet also by limitations. Edward was no longer king. His influence on political affairs was minimal, and his public role was largely ceremonial or social. Yet, for Edward and Wallis, the personal satisfaction of being together outweighed the loss of authority, illustrating the profound human desire to prioritize love over power. Despite living in exile, Edward's actions continued to influence British politics and the monarchy. His abdication forced the monarchy to confront the question of succession under unusual circumstances. The smooth transition to George VI, though initially challenging, ultimately reinforced the monarchy's resilience. Edward's absence highlighted the flexibility and adaptability of royal institutions. Even as tradition was disrupted, the monarchy endured. Guided by careful management and public trust, public fascination with Edward and Wallis persisted for decades. They became figures of global intrigue, appearing at social events, traveling internationally, and maintaining connections with influential figures. Their story fueled literature, film, and historical analysis, transforming a political crisis into a cultural narrative about love, sacrifice, and the tension between personal desire and public duty. Edward's decision, though controversial, became emblematic of the human struggle to reconcile emotion with obligation. Historians often reflect on the abdication as a turning point in modern monarchy. It underscored the vulnerability of royal authority to personal choice, and the complex interplay between tradition, law, and human desire. Edward VIII's life illustrates the paradox of monarchy. A position of immense symbolic power can coexist with personal constraint, and even a king's choice can reverberate through political systems, international perception, and cultural imagination. Yet, the story of Edward VIII is also deeply personal. It is the narrative of a man caught between love and duty, navigating expectations he never fully embraced, and choosing a path that brought happiness but demanded sacrifice. Edward's abdication reminds us that history is not only shaped by battles, treaties, or legislation, but also by individual decisions, emotions, and the courage or audacity to follow one's heart. And so, as we consider the life of Edward VIII and the woman for whom he relinquished a throne, one final question emerges, reflective and enduring. Can the pursuit of personal fulfillment justify the surrender of power? And how do such choices echo through history, shaping not only the individual, but also the institutions and people left behind? a young archduchess from Austria, arrived at the glittering halls of Versailles, unaware that her every move would be watched, judged, and remembered. Marie Antoinette would become the symbol of royal excess, and yet the reality of her life was far more complex than scandalous whispers suggested. Born on November 2, 1755, in Vienna, Marie Antoinette was the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. From her earliest years, she was groomed to understand the subtleties of dynastic politics, ceremonial protocol, and international diplomacy. Life in the Austrian court combined luxury with intense scrutiny. Every letter, gesture, and social interaction was recorded and evaluated, preparing young Marie for a life where personal desires often collided with political necessity. Marie's childhood was marked by contrasts. She experienced both the warmth of familial relationships and the rigid discipline of imperial instruction. Music, dance, and languages filled her days, alongside lessons in etiquette, diplomacy, and the expectations of nobility. She learned that charm, intelligence, and composure were tools of survival. In courts where alliances, marriages, and succession shaped the future of empires, yet alongside these lessons, Marie developed a spirited personality, curious, lively, and independent-minded. These traits would both endear her to some and provoke suspicion among others. Once she entered the French court, at the age of 14, Marie was sent to France to marry Louis Auguste, heir to the French throne, who would later become Louis XVI. The marriage, arranged to solidify an alliance between Austria and France, was a monumental shift in her life. She left behind her family, language, and familiar surroundings, entering a court governed by complex social hierarchies, rigid etiquette, and endless scrutiny. Versailles, with its gilded halls, manicured gardens, and intricate rituals, was a world of both wonder and constraint, where every action could be praised, criticized, or misconstrued. Marie's adjustment to Versailles was gradual. She faced a court steeped in protocol, where precedents dictated behavior, and gossip could shape reputations as quickly as policy shaped empires. Initially shy and reserved, she relied on her innate charm, wit, and intelligence to navigate the intricate web of court politics. Yet her foreign origins, combined with her youth and occasional missteps, made her a target for suspicion. Courtiers whispered about her Austrian heritage, her influence over the king, and her perceived extravagance. These murmurs would grow louder over time, feeding narratives that often exaggerated or distorted reality. Despite the constraints, Marie found ways to cultivate personal agency within the palace. She developed friendships with select courtiers, engaged in cultural pursuits, and participated in charitable endeavors. Music, theater, and fashion became outlets for self-expression, allowing her to navigate the pressures of court life while carving out spaces of autonomy. These activities, however, were double-edged. While they brought enjoyment and social engagement, they also fueled rumors of frivolity, decadence, and excess. The line between personal indulgence and public perception was perilously thin. The early years of Marie Antoinette's marriage were not without challenge. Louis Auguste was inexperienced, shy, and uncertain in his role, often leaving decisions and public engagements to others. This dynamic placed additional pressure on Marie, who, as Dauphine and later queen, became increasingly visible in political and social arenas. Courtiers and public observers scrutinized her every move, interpreting both her actions and inactions as signs of character, competence, or moral standing. In this environment, appearances were paramount, and the difference between private behavior and public perception could have lasting consequences. Rumors and whisperings began to accumulate, sowing the seeds of the scandals that would follow. Critics accused her of extravagant spending, indulgence in luxurious fashion, and detachment from the hardships faced by ordinary French citizens. While some criticisms reflected reality, many were amplified by court rivalries, xenophobia toward her Austrian background, and the political tensions of a monarchy under increasing scrutiny. These narratives, exaggerated or distorted, would later define her public image, overshadowing the complexities and nuances of her daily life and responsibilities. Even in these early years, Marie Antoinette demonstrated a capacity to influence the court subtly. She understood the symbolic power of appearances, cultivated relationships with allies, and maneuvered within the rigid structures of Versailles. Yet, the tension between private desire and public expectation remained constant. Her every indulgence could be magnified into a perceived scandal, and her youthful misjudgments would later be used as evidence of it. Could a young queen, constrained by protocol, foreign origins, and relentless scrutiny, ever escape the court's judgment, or was she destined to become a symbol of scandal? Whether fairly or unfairly judged, oral and political failure, as Marie navigated the gilded corridors of Versailles, a central question lingered, unresolved and haunting. The palace glittered with wealth, yet outside the gates, whispers of discontent grew louder. Marie Antoinette's every gown, every party, and every gesture became fodder for gossip, and the seeds of scandal were quietly planted. As Marie Antoinette matured into her role as queen, her visibility and influence within the French court increased. She had moved from being a shy and inexperienced Dauphine to a prominent figure whose tastes, choices, and actions were closely observed. The queen's life was intertwined with ceremony, politics, and the delicate art of navigating Versailles, a court whose rituals and hierarchies were both elaborate and unforgiving. Every appearance, every word, and every indulgence was scrutinized, creating an environment in which personal behavior could quickly become political narrative. Marie's personal style and passion for fashion became a focal point of attention. She embraced elaborate gowns, ornate hairstyles, and exquisite jewelry, setting trends that echoed throughout the nobility. Yet this passion, admired by some, attracted criticism from others. Pamphlets and rumors circulated in Paris, portraying the queen as excessively indulgent and detached from the plight of ordinary citizens, struggling with economic hardship. While her spending was in part consistent with the expectations of monarchy and court ritual, public perception magnified the extravagance, feeding a narrative that would have lasting consequences. Beyond fashion, Marie Antoinette sought to shape cultural life at Versailles. She supported music, theater, and charitable endeavors, often hosting performances and gatherings that brought artists and courtiers together. These activities, intended to enhance the court's cultural standing and foster a sense of refinement, were also interpreted by critics as frivolity and moral laxity. In a society already tense from economic pressures, political instability, and social inequality, the queen's lifestyle became a symbol onto which resentment and fear could be projected. One of the earliest and most infamous scandals to touch Marie Antoinette involved the diamond necklace affair. Though she was not directly involved, the episode, in which fraudsters attempted to use her name to acquire a costly necklace, became a source of widespread gossip. The public, already suspicious of her behavior and Austrian origins, interpreted the incident as evidence of her corruption and greed. Newspapers, pamphlets, and caricatures exaggerated the story, presenting Marie as morally questionable and politically manipulative. The scandal exemplified how perception, rather than reality, often dictated reputation at Versailles and in wider French society. Marie Antoinette's personal life, including her relationship with Louis XVI and her role as mother to future heirs, was also under constant scrutiny. Letters and memoirs from attendants describe her attempts to nurture her children while balancing ceremonial duties and political pressures. Yet public fascination often ignored the complexities of parenting and partnership within a highly publicized royal environment. Instead, observers focused on perceived moral failings, amplifying any mistake or indulgence as proof of character deficiency. Political tensions in France further complicated the queen's life. The monarchy faced criticism from intellectuals, reformists, and revolutionary thinkers who questioned the legitimacy and effectiveness of royal governance. Marie Antoinette, as a visible and influential figure, became a symbol of the monarchy's perceived excesses. Pamphlets, essays, and political commentary frequently invoked her as a personification of decadence, ignoring nuance or context. In this environment, a foreign-born queen with personal interests and ambitions was vulnerable to misunderstanding and manipulation. Despite mounting criticism, Marie Antoinette remained active in courtly and cultural affairs, demonstrating intelligence, political awareness, and resilience. She developed alliances, supported charitable works, and engaged in diplomacy, though these efforts were often overshadowed by sensationalized reports of her extravagance. The Queen's experience illustrates a tension familiar to those in power. Personal agency can be constrained by public perception, and even well-intentioned actions may be interpreted as self-interest or moral failing. Even as scandals began to define her public image, Marie Antoinette displayed a remarkable capacity to navigate the pressures of court life. She understood that every gesture carried meaning, that appearances could dictate political consequences, and that rumors could have as much impact as legislation. Yet, despite her acumen, the Queen was increasingly isolated from the public's trust, making her vulnerable to attacks that blurred the line between truth and exaggeration. And so, as whispers grew louder outside the palace gates and caricatures painted her as a figure of excess, one unresolved question began to dominate the narrative. Could Marie Antoinette survive the tide of public opinion and political intrigue? Or was she destined to become a cautionary tale of a queen overwhelmed by scandal, disconnected from the people she ruled? The palace gates of Versailles, once a sanctuary of opulence, closed behind a queen now isolated, feared, and reviled. Marie Antoinette faced not only her enemies but also the relentless judgment of history itself. By the late 1780s, tensions in France had escalated dramatically. Economic hardship, food shortages, and political discontent had created a climate ripe for revolution. Marie Antoinette, already the subject of rumors and criticism, became a focal point for public anger. Pamphlets labeled her as wasteful and indifferent, while political cartoons portrayed her as the embodiment of monarchical excess. Though some criticisms were exaggerated or unfounded, they resonated with a populace increasingly frustrated by systemic inequities and the perceived detachment of the royal family. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 marked a turning point in Marie Antoinette's life. Versailles, once a symbol of stability and ceremonial splendor, transformed into a stage of uncertainty and fear. Demonstrations and riots punctuated the streets, and the Queen's movements were monitored with suspicion. While she continued to fulfill ceremonial obligations, her influence over political decisions diminished, and her personal safety became a growing concern. The court's protective routines, once efficient, now provided little security against the rising tide of revolution. Marie Antoinette's attempts to navigate this dangerous terrain were met with mixed success. She advised the king, engaged in diplomatic correspondence, and attempted to maintain order. Yet public perception of her actions often contradicted reality. Decisions made to preserve tradition or protect her family were interpreted as selfishness or treachery. The disconnect between intent and interpretation widened, illustrating the precarious position of a figure constantly observed, judged, and scrutinized by both allies and enemies. In 1792, the royal family was forcibly moved from Versailles to Paris, confined first in the Tuileries Palace and later imprisoned in the Temple. These relocations reflected both the revolutionary government's distrust and the strategic aim to limit royal influence. Marie Antoinette's life became a sequence of constrained routines, harsh supervision, and constant surveillance. Attendants recorded her attempts to maintain dignity, care for her children, and understand the rapidly shifting political landscape, revealing a queen acutely aware of her vulnerability, yet striving to uphold personal and maternal responsibilities. The Queen's trial in 1793 epitomized the revolutionary justice system's blending of political expedience, public spectacle, and moral judgment. Accused of conspiring against the state, misappropriating funds, and even moral corruption, Marie Antoinette faced prosecutors determined to dismantle the symbolic power of the monarchy. Her defense, composed of reasoned arguments, personal testimony, and appeals to character, was overshadowed by public expectation, fervor, and predetermined conclusions. The trial became a mechanism not only to punish perceived crimes, but also to reinforce revolutionary ideals by publicly condemning a living emblem of the old regime. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Revolution. Witnesses describe the Queen's composure in her final moments, maintaining dignity and presence of mind despite the fear and inevitability surrounding her. Her death marked the definitive end of her influence, yet paradoxically it cemented her legacy. The Queen, who had been vilified for extravagance and perceived detachment, became, in memory and cultural representation, a complex figure embodying both tragedy and myth. The aftermath of her death extended beyond personal loss, shaping France and the monarchy's historical narrative. Revolutionary authorities sought to erase the symbols of monarchy, while historians, writers, and artists grappled with the paradox of her life. A young queen navigating an impossible intersection of personal desire, ceremonial obligation, and political upheaval. Marie Antoinette's story illustrates how perception can dominate reality, as her legacy was as much shaped by rumors and public interpretation as by documented actions. In modern times, historical analysis has sought to disentangle myth from fact. Scholars examine letters, contemporaneous accounts, and official records to reveal a queen who was intelligent, politically aware, and personally engaged, yet constrained by circumstances, cultural expectations, and the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. Her life and death highlight the consequences of living in an environment where personal choices are inseparable from public interpretation, and where societal pressures can magnify both misjudgment and rumor. Marie Antoinette's story is not merely one of scandal, luxury, or downfall. It is a narrative of resilience under relentless observation, of human complexity amidst social upheaval, and of the ways in which perception, rumor, and interpretation can eclipse reality. She remains a figure both historically grounded and mythically enduring, emblematic of the challenges faced by individuals navigating power, expectation, and the human desire for autonomy. And so, reflecting on her life, one final question emerges, lingering across centuries. Can a person, confined by duty, expectation, and public scrutiny, ever truly live authentically? Or is history destined to remember only the shadows cast by rumor and perception? Born into the splendor of Romanov palaces, Nicholas II inherited a throne burdened with tradition, expectation, and unrest. His reign would ultimately vanish into the shadows of revolution, leaving questions that history still struggles to answer. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, later known as Nicholas II, was born on May 18, 1868, in the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo near St. Petersburg. As the eldest son of Alexander III and Empress Maria Feodorovna, he was groomed from infancy to carry forward the legacy of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries. From the beginning, Nicholas's life was defined by ritual, education, and the weight of expectation. Every gesture, word, and accomplishment was carefully noted, preparing him for a role that demanded both personal discipline and unwavering devotion to the empire. The young Nicholas received a meticulous education, combining formal instruction in history, languages, military strategy, and theology with lessons in the traditions and responsibilities of monarchy. Tutors emphasized loyalty, public duty, and the sanctity of the autocracy, fostering in him a worldview centered on service to God and country. Yet alongside this disciplined upbringing, Nicholas developed a reserved and introspective personality, often contemplative, cautious, and deeply conscious of his responsibilities. These traits, while reflective of his noble upbringing, would both aid and complicate his later role as ruler of a vast and diverse empire. Nicholas's early experiences with military and public life further shaped his understanding of leadership. He accompanied his father on official visits, observed the administration of local governors, and studied the intricacies of diplomacy with foreign powers. Despite the luxury and privilege surrounding him, Nicholas was aware of the empire's challenges: a population of over 100 million, complex social hierarchies, economic disparity, and the growing influence of revolutionary ideas. He was trained to balance ceremonial duties with the practical demands of governance, yet the pace of change and unrest in Russian society presented obstacles that even the most careful preparation could not fully anticipate. In 1894, following the sudden death of Alexander III, Nicholas ascended the throne as Tsar of Russia. His coronation was a grand ceremony blending religious devotion with imperial pomp, symbolizing both continuity and the immense responsibilities of leadership. From the outset, Nicholas faced the dual pressures of maintaining tradition while responding to societal change. He was committed to autocracy, believing in the divine right of kings. Yet the realities of the late 19th century required navigating emerging political movements, industrialization, and social unrest. Early in his reign, Nicholas married Princess Alix of Hesse, who became Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Their union, rooted in both personal affection and dynastic alliance, introduced additional dimensions to the emperor's responsibilities. Alexandra was deeply devoted to the royal family, yet her foreign background and rigid personality sometimes created tension within the court. Together, Nicholas and Alexandra would face personal challenges, including the health struggles of their children, which compounded the pressures of political leadership. Their marriage, while loving, was continually tested by circumstance, public scrutiny, and the demands of imperial life. Nicholas's domestic policies and approach to governance reflected a cautious conservatism. He sought to preserve autocratic power while occasionally accommodating reform, balancing between maintaining order and responding to growing demands for political representation. The creation of the State Duma after the 1905 revolution demonstrated his willingness to compromise under pressure. Yet Nicholas remained fundamentally committed to the principle of absolute monarchy. This tension between tradition and modernization would define his reign and contribute to the instability that ultimately engulfed Russia. The empire itself was vast, culturally diverse, and politically complex. Nicholas faced challenges in industrializing Russia, managing peasant unrest, and addressing the grievances of workers, intellectuals, and emerging political parties. Social inequality, coupled with rigid hierarchies, created an environment in which revolutionary ideas found fertile ground. Nicholas, though personally conscientious, often struggled to grasp the speed and intensity of societal change, a factor that would later exacerbate revolutionary sentiment. Internationally, Nicholas maintained alliances and navigated tensions with European powers, balancing the demands of diplomacy with the needs of domestic governance. The interplay between external pressures and internal unrest created a delicate environment in which any misstep could have profound consequences. Nicholas's decisions, cautious yet sometimes indecisive, reflected both his personal temperament and the immense weight of responsibility he bore as emperor. Even in these early years, the stage was being set for profound upheaval. The combination of personal devotion to tradition, the pressures of modernization, and the volatility of social unrest meant that Nicholas's reign would be defined not only by his policies, but also by events beyond his control. The careful balance he sought to maintain was fragile, and the forces of change were quietly, inexorably, moving toward confrontation. And so, as Nicholas II assumed the throne with solemnity and resolve, one unresolved question lingered over the vast Russian Empire. Could a cautious, well-intentioned ruler navigate the tides of revolution? Or was the Romanov dynasty already on a path toward vanishing from power, leaving history to wonder at what might have been? The empire groaned under the weight of war, famine, and unrest. Nicholas II faced crises that would test not only his leadership, but the very survival of the Romanov dynasty. The early years of Nicholas II's reign were relatively stable, but simmering unrest in Russia foreshadowed the crises to come. Russia, an immense empire stretching across Europe and Asia, was marked by stark social and economic inequality. Peasants formed the vast majority of the population, often living in poverty and under feudal-like conditions, while urban workers struggled with low wages and poor working conditions. Nicholas, steeped in tradition and convinced of the sanctity of autocracy, believed that reforms must proceed cautiously. Yet the pace of societal change accelerated beyond what the monarchy could comfortably manage. The Russo-Japanese War 1904-1905 became the first major test of Nicholas's authority. The conflict, fought over imperial ambitions in East Asia, exposed the weaknesses of Russia's military and administrative structures. Initial Russian defeats shocked the empire, eroding confidence in the Tsar's leadership. Soldiers returning from the front lines brought stories of logistical failures, poor morale, and inadequate planning. Meanwhile, news of these defeats spread rapidly through urban centers, fueling dissatisfaction among workers and intellectuals. Nicholas's detachment from military strategy and reliance on advisors reflected both his cautious nature and the limitations of centralized authority in an empire of vast distances and complex bureaucracy. As the war dragged on, domestic unrest escalated. In January 1905, the massacre known as Bloody Sunday occurred, when unarmed protesters marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition for reform. Soldiers fired on the crowd, killing and wounding hundreds. The event marked a turning point, shattering the perception of Nicholas as a benevolent ruler and igniting widespread strikes, demonstrations, and uprisings across the empire. Political opposition grew bolder, encompassing liberal reformers, socialist revolutionaries, and anarchist groups, all demanding changes that challenged the foundations of autocracy. Faced with mounting pressure, Nicholas reluctantly agreed to create the State Duma, a legislative assembly intended to provide limited representation and appease reformist factions. While this concession was a milestone in Russian political development, it highlighted the limits of compromise within the framework of an autocratic system. Nicholas remained deeply attached to the principle of divine right and retained ultimate control over governance, often undermining the Duma's authority through vetoes, dissolution of sessions, and administrative maneuvering. The tension between tradition and reform created instability, as neither revolutionaries nor loyalists were fully satisfied with the arrangement. Throughout these challenges, Nicholas's personal temperament influenced his decision-making. He was cautious, indecisive at times, and deeply reliant on the advice of family members, particularly his wife Alexandra, and trusted ministers. Alexandra's influence grew as Nicholas increasingly relied on her judgment in both domestic and international matters. However, her strong opinions, compounded by her German origins and later attachment to figures like Grigory Rasputin, created further friction within government circles and fueled public suspicion. Rumors of corruption, manipulation, and moral weakness began to circulate, undermining Nicholas's credibility and weakening the monarchy's standing. The years following the 1905 revolution saw continued unrest. Strikes, peasant uprisings, and revolutionary plotting persisted, punctuated by violent confrontations with government forces. Nicholas sought to maintain order through a combination of repression and selective reform. Yet neither approach fully addressed the underlying grievances, economic challenges, rapid urbanization, and the spread of revolutionary ideology created a volatile environment in which every misstep could have amplified consequences. Nicholas's commitment to tradition, combined with his cautious temperament, often left him reacting slowly to crises rather than shaping events proactively. Internationally, Nicholas faced challenges that further strained his rule. Relations with European powers were complex, marked by shifting alliances, the rise of Germany as a military power, and the delicate balancing act of maintaining influence in the Balkans. These external pressures compounded internal instability, leaving the Tsar's government stretched thin and vulnerable to both domestic and foreign crises. Nicholas's adherence to autocratic principles limited his flexibility in addressing the rapidly changing geopolitical landscape, setting the stage for future catastrophe. Even as Nicholas navigated these challenges, revolutionary movements continued to grow in sophistication and determination. Socialist parties, anarchists, and nationalist groups coordinated strikes, publications, and protests, increasing pressure on the monarchy. Public dissatisfaction was further fueled by famine, poverty, and perceptions of corruption within the royal court. Nicholas's personal life, including his devotion to his family and reliance on Alexandra, became entangled with political controversy, as every domestic choice was scrutinized and politicized. The cumulative effect of war, revolution, and public unrest left Nicholas II's authority weakened. By the years leading up to World War I, the monarchy faced a fragile legitimacy, with political compromise often seen as insufficient and repression viewed as harsh. The stage was set for the ultimate test of Tsar's reign, as forces beyond his control, both internal and external, converged toward upheaval. And so, as Nicholas II confronted a Russian empire simmering with unrest, one unresolved question loomed large. Could a cautious and well-meaning ruler maintain control of an empire under the pressures of war, revolution, and social change, or was the fall of the Romanov dynasty already inevitable? As Russia plunged into war and revolution, the last emperor cloned the tradition even as the world around him crumbled. Nicholas II's final days were defined not by power, but by captivity, uncertainty, and the inexorable march of history. By 1914, Nicholas II's reign had already been tested by internal unrest and political challenges. With the outbreak of World War I, the Russian Empire faced unprecedented strain. Nicholas assumed personal command of the Russian army, leaving domestic governance largely in the hands of Empress Alexandra and her advisors. While his intention was to inspire confidence and demonstrate leadership, the decision exposed him to criticism for military defeats, logistical failures, and the broader hardships endured by soldiers and civilians alike. The war placed immense pressure on the empire. Supply lines faltered, morale waned, and casualties mounted. Cities faced shortages of food, fuel, and essential goods, intensifying public discontent. Nicholas's leadership style, cautious, detail-oriented, but often indecisive, proved ill-suited for the rapidly changing conditions of total war. Reliance on Alexandra and Rasputin, whose influence over court appointments and policies became increasingly controversial, further eroded confidence in the monarchy. Rumors, propaganda, and political agitation amplified dissatisfaction, painting the royal family as incompetent or indifferent. By early 1917, the situation reached a breaking point. The February Revolution erupted, fueled by strikes, protests, and military mutinies in Petrograd. The Tsar's authority collapsed almost overnight. Government officials and soldiers abandoned loyalty, and revolutionary councils assumed control. Nicholas, faced with an untenable position, abdicated the throne in March 1917, initially intending to pass it to his son Alexei, but ultimately naming his brother Michael as successor, who refused the crown. This marked the end of over 3 centuries of Romanov rule, and Nicholas's abdication symbolized the fragility of absolute monarchy in the modern era. Following abdication, Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest, first in the Alexandra Palace, then moved to Tobolsk in Siberia. The family endured harsh winters, limited communication, and constant surveillance. Despite the hardships, Nicholas sought to maintain a sense of dignity and order, caring for his family while navigating the uncertainty of revolutionary Russia. The Romanovs' captivity illustrated the personal cost of political upheaval, a lifetime of privilege and authority reduced to confinement and dependency. In October 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution further transformed the political landscape. The new regime, seeking to consolidate power and eliminate potential threats, decided to move the family to Yekaterinburg. The Romanovs' isolation deepened, and conditions deteriorated. Guards, suspicion, and secrecy became the norm. Letters, diaries, and testimonies from those around the family described the increasing anxiety, awareness of danger, and attempts to maintain normalcy within constrained circumstances. Nicholas, once the most powerful man in Russia, confronted the ultimate loss of control. His fate and that of his family were entirely in the hands of revolutionaries. On July 17, 1918, in the basement of the Ipativ house, Nicholas II, Alexandra, their 5 children, and loyal attendants were executed by Bolshevik forces. The killings were methodical, aiming to eliminate any potential claimants to the throne. Eyewitness accounts and historical investigations detail the tragic sequence. The family gathered, confronted their fate with varying degrees of courage and composure, and were killed. The act marked not only the violent end of individual lives, but also the symbolic closure of the Romanov dynasty, a chapter of Russian history spanning centuries. Nicholas II's legacy is complex. Historians examine his reign through multiple lenses. A well-meaning yet indecisive ruler, a monarch constrained by tradition and a rapidly modernizing world, and a father devoted to his family yet unable to respond effectively to the tides of revolution. The fall of the Romanovs highlights the vulnerabilities of centralized power, the consequences of inaction during systemic crises, and the human cost of political upheaval. While some contemporaries viewed Nicholas as weak or misguided, modern analysis often emphasizes the structural challenges and historical forces beyond his control. The story of Nicholas II also serves as a cautionary tale about the relationship between authority and accountability. Absolute power, even when wielded with sincerity, is insufficient if disconnected from the realities of society, economy, and public sentiment. Nicholas's personal virtues, devotion to family, religious conviction, and commitment to tradition could not compensate for systemic failures, misjudgments, or the accelerating momentum of revolutionary movements in the centuries since. The Romanovs have become subjects of fascination, myth, and historical inquiry. Scholars, writers, and filmmakers explore the final emperor's life to understand the human dimension of monarchy, the personal choices, constraints, and vulnerabilities of individuals at the pinnacle of power. Nicholas II's vanishing from history through abdication, imprisonment, and execution underscores how quickly privilege can be rendered powerless, and how the tides of political and social change can sweep away even the most entrenched institutions. And so, reflecting on the final days of Nicholas II and the fate of the Romanov family, one enduring question remains: can even the most powerful ruler survive when the weight of history, societal change, and public discontent converge? Or are some destinies inevitably shaped by forces far beyond human control? A young king of a small state became the ruler of an entire empire. Yet his greatest conquest was not of lands, but of the secrets of life and death. Qin Shi Huang sought immortality even as his empire trembled beneath his feet. Born into 59 BC as Yingzhong, the future Qin Shi Huang was thrust into a world of war, strategy, and political intrigue from the very beginning. He became king of the state of Qin at the age of 13, following the death of his father, King Juanxiang. Despite his youth, he was quickly surrounded by advisors, ministers, and regents who guided the early years of his reign, shaping the foundation upon which he would later forge a unified China. Early accounts describe a boy both intelligent and ruthless, capable of strategic thinking and willing to wield authority decisively, even at a young age. The Warring States period in China was marked by 7 major states competing for dominance. Qin was initially one of the less powerful states, yet through a combination of military innovation, administrative reform, and strategic alliances, Yingzhong expanded his influence steadily. His reign emphasized meritocracy, centralization, and strict legalism, a philosophy advocating rigid law and order as the backbone of governance. These principles, though often harsh, allowed him to consolidate power effectively, suppress dissent, and gradually overpower rival states. One of Qin Shi Huang's earliest priorities was to strengthen the state infrastructure. Roads, canals, and fortifications were expanded, improving both trade and military mobility. Agricultural reforms ensured greater food production and redistribution, stabilizing the economy to support expansion. These practical measures, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, were crucial to the success of his military campaigns and the administrative efficiency of the future empire. The young king's understanding of logistics, economics, and statecraft set him apart from his contemporaries, even as it cultivated fear and resentment among those who suffered under strict regulations. By his early 20s, Qin Shi Huang had successfully subdued the remaining 6 states, achieving the unification of China into 21 BC. Declaring himself the first emperor, he centralized authority like no ruler before him. Provinces were reorganized under appointed governors, laws were standardized, and weights, measures, and currency were unified. The emperor also undertook projects to standardize written language, aiming to facilitate administration and communication across his vast empire. These initiatives, though technically boring to some, had a lasting impact, creating the structural foundation for centuries of Chinese governance. Yet alongside these pragmatic measures, Qin Shi Huang's reign was marked by secrecy, paranoia, and an obsession with immortality, fearing death and driven by reports of elixirs promising eternal life. He sought knowledge from alchemists and mystics. Expeditions were launched in search of legendary ingredients and islands that promised immortality. The emperor's preoccupation with life extension influenced both his personal habits and administrative decisions, shaping his daily routines, delegations, and court priorities. His advisors navigated a delicate balance, maintaining loyalty while managing the eccentric demands of a ruler who simultaneously commanded immense power and feared its inevitable end. Military campaigns were relentless. Qin Shi Huang relied on both strategic genius and harsh discipline to maintain order, quell rebellions, and expand borders. Soldiers, conscripted laborers, and peasants often faced grueling conditions, constructing fortifications, roads, and the early foundations of what would become the Great Wall of China. The emperor's focus on monumental projects reflected both practical concerns, defense and transportation, and a desire for immortality through enduring structures. These projects consumed vast resources and human labor, illustrating the tension between visionary leadership and the human cost of absolute authority. The emperor's personal life, while less documented than his public achievements, reveals a man conscious of power, legacy, and the mysteries of life itself. His obsession with immortality extended to elaborate tomb construction, secret passages, and legendary armies of terracotta soldiers designed to accompany him in the afterlife. Even as he consolidated China's lands and laws, Qin Shi Huang's mind was consumed by the unknowable, death, legacy, and the promise of eternal rule beyond the mortal world. Yet, as the emperor pursued these ambitions, there were early signs of instability. Resentment among conquered peoples, the harsh treatment of dissenters, and the enormous demands placed on laborers created tension beneath the surface. Advisors warned of potential uprisings, omens were recorded, and historians later noted that Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality may have distracted him from consolidating loyalty among the populace. These overlooked details, logistical burdens, public dissatisfaction, and the emperor's preoccupation with death would later play a crucial role in the unraveling of the Qin dynasty. After his mysterious disappearance, even as the empire flourished under centralized governance and military might, one unresolved question loomed over the young emperor's legacy. Could a ruler who commanded unparalleled power truly escape the inevitability of death? Or would Qin Shi Huang vanish into history, leaving an empire built on ambition, fear, and the pursuit of immortality? Stone by stone, wall by wall, palace by palace, Qin Shi Huang sought to leave a mark that would defy time itself. Yet the labor, law, and fear that built his empire also sowed the seeds of unrest that history would never forget. After proclaiming himself first emperor, Qin Shi Huang embarked on an ambitious program of monumental construction. Roads, canals, and fortifications were not merely tools of administration, they were instruments of control, connecting the far reaches of the empire while projecting the emperor's authority. The construction of defensive walls along northern borders marked the early foundations of what later became the Great Wall of China. These walls, built from tamped earth, stone, and timber, were intended to deter invasions and consolidate imperial power. But they demanded the toil of thousands of conscripted laborers under grueling conditions. The scale of these projects was staggering. Peasants, prisoners, and soldiers were mobilized to transport materials, construct fortifications, and maintain infrastructure. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of laborers participated in these endeavors, many suffering injury, exhaustion, or death. The harshness of these tasks exemplifies a recurring tension. In Qin Shi Huang's reign, the drive to create a lasting legacy through infrastructure often came at immense human cost. While these efforts strengthened central authority and enhanced defense, they also fostered resentment, planting the early seeds of rebellion that would erupt after the emperor's death. Alongside construction, Qin Shi Huang continued to implement sweeping legal and administrative reforms. He standardized weights and measures, introduced uniform currency, and created a codified legal system enforced across the empire. These measures enhanced commerce, improved taxation, and simplified governance, contributing to the unification and stability of the newly consolidated state. Yet, these same reforms, enforced rigorously and without leniency, bred dissatisfaction among local elites and the general populace, many of whom resisted the imposition of uniform laws and the erosion of regional autonomy. The emperor's obsession with immortality became increasingly apparent during these years. Reports describe expeditions to remote mountains in search of elixirs, consultations with alchemists, and the incorporation of mystical practices into daily life. His court became a complex mixture of bureaucrats, military officials, and mystics, reflecting both the practical needs of governance and the personal preoccupations of a ruler determined to conquer death itself. Historical accounts suggest that the emperor consumed concoctions believed to prolong life, some of which contain mercury or other toxic substances, potentially contributing to declining health. In later years, despite these personal obsessions, Qin Shi Huang remained attentive to threats to his authority. He executed conspirators, quelled dissent, and relocated populations as necessary to maintain control. His intelligence network extended across the empire, reporting on rebellion, sedition, or inefficiency. While this vigilance strengthened the central state, it also created an atmosphere of fear and tension, further alienating segments of the population. Officials and laborers alike became acutely aware of the emperor's reach and power, and the combination of harsh law, monumental demands, and mystical obsession contributed to a sense of unease. Across the empire, the emperor's construction projects were not limited to defensive works. Palaces, administrative centers, and elaborate tombs were commissioned, intended to demonstrate imperial grandeur and ensure a lasting legacy. Most famous among these is the emperor's mausoleum. Surrounded by the terracotta army, thousands of life-size statues designed to accompany him in the afterlife. The meticulous planning and scale of these projects underscore Qin Shi Huang's focus on permanence, immortality, and the projection of power beyond the limitations of mortal life. Each soldier, chariot, and artifact reflected a desire to control not only the living empire, but also the world of spirits and memory. Yet, beneath the grandeur, unrest simmered. Conscription, forced labor, and harsh punishments created widespread discontent among peasants and soldiers. Reports of rebellions in distant provinces were suppressed, but disaffection continued to grow, exacerbated by the emperor's focus on immortality rather than addressing social grievances. Advisors warned that discontent could threaten the very stability he sought to preserve. Yet Qin Shi Huang's attention remained divided between administration, construction, and the pursuit of eternal life. even as the emperor exerted unprecedented control over China. One unresolved question began to haunt historians and contemporaries alike. Could a ruler obsessed with immortality secure a lasting legacy in both life and death? Or would Qin Shi Huang vanish from the world he sought to dominate, leaving an empire both unified and uneasy under the weight of his ambition? Born into a world of tribal conflict and harsh landscapes, Temujin would rise to become Genghis Khan, a ruler whose conquests reshaped continents and whose final resting place remains one of history. As enduring mysteries, Temujin, later known to history as Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 in the rugged steppes of Mongolia. The Mongol world was fractured, composed of countless clans and tribes often locked in cycles of alliance and conflict. Life on the steppes was harsh. Winters were brutal, resources scarce, and survival depended on both skill and adaptability. Temujin's early years were marked by personal tragedy and political instability, experiences that would shape his character and leadership style. His father, a tribal leader, was poisoned when Temujin was still a boy, leaving the family vulnerable and marginalized. Temujin, his mother, and siblings faced extreme hardship, struggling to survive amidst rival clans and limited resources. These formative years instilled in him resilience, strategic thinking, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Observing alliances, betrayals, and the shifting loyalties of neighboring tribes taught him lessons that would later inform his approach to governance and warfare. From a young age, Temujin demonstrated a combination of intelligence, charisma, and ruthlessness. He forged alliances through marriage, negotiation, and diplomacy, yet did not shy away from using force when necessary. Early campaigns involved defending his clan's territory, retaliating against rival factions, and gradually expanding his influence. These skirmishes, though minor in the scale of later conquests, were crucial in establishing his reputation as a capable and determined leader. The unification of the Mongol tribes required both strategic brilliance and an ability to inspire loyalty. Temujin introduced a merit-based system for military and administrative appointments, rewarding skill and loyalty rather than merely relying on noble birth. This approach disrupted traditional hierarchies and enabled him to consolidate power more effectively than his rivals. His vision extended beyond immediate gains. He sought not only to dominate, but to create a more cohesive and disciplined Mongol society capable of sustained expansion. Early alliances with neighboring tribes involved careful negotiation and occasionally brutal enforcement. Temujin's understanding of the delicate balance between fear and respect became evident in his dealings with allies and enemies alike. Those who opposed him often faced decisive retribution, while loyal followers were rewarded generously, creating a complex system of incentives and deterrents. The combination of strategic foresight, personal charisma, and willingness to enforce authority set the stage for his emergence as Genghis Khan, title meaning universal ruler, and signaled the beginning of a transformation that would reshape Eurasia. As Temujin consolidated his power, his campaigns became more ambitious. He began targeting key trade routes, rival tribal confederations, and strategic territories in the steppes. Mobility, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare became central to his approach. He leveraged the natural advantages of the Mongolian landscape, using speed, surprise, and adaptability to outmaneuver larger or more established opponents. These tactics, while seemingly simple, reflected a deep understanding of both terrain and human nature. The social and administrative innovations implemented during these early years also contributed to the stability of his emerging empire. Temujin codified laws, streamlined governance, and imposed a disciplined military hierarchy. Even in these boring organizational details such as census taking, taxation systems, and standardized military ranks, one can see the foundation of the empire that would stretch from Asia to Europe. These structural measures ensured that conquests were not temporary gains but part of a sustainable and organized system of control. Yet, for all his accomplishments, the Mongolian steppes remained a volatile environment. Rivals watched closely. Alliances could shift overnight, and survival depended on constant vigilance. Temujin's combination of caution, planning, and ruthlessness was essential. Yet one unresolved question lingered over his early rise. Could a man born into chaos truly unify the Mongol tribes and transform them into a force capable of reshaping the known world? Or would the harsh realities of the steppes eventually claim even the most brilliant strategist? Even as the empire prospered under his iron rule, Qin Shi Huang could not escape the inevitability of death. In secrecy and shadow, the first emperor of China vanished, leaving a legacy both monumental and mysterious. By the final years of his life, Qin Shi Huang's health had begun to decline. Centuries of grueling work, constant travel across the empire, and consumption of supposed life-extending elixirs had taken a toll on the once vigorous emperor. Yet his obsession with immortality remained undiminished. He continued to dispatch envoys to search for legendary herbs, consult alchemists, and explore methods to extend life indefinitely. Court records and historical accounts describe his anxiety about death and his insistence on secrecy, reflecting a ruler both aware of his mortality and determined to overcome it through extraordinary means. Into 10 BCE, during an inspection tour in the eastern provinces, Qin Shi Huang fell seriously ill. According to historical chronicles, the emperor's health deteriorated rapidly, yet the news of his condition was kept strictly hidden from the public, and even many court officials and ministers were sworn to secrecy, while elaborate measures were taken to conceal the emperor's death until arrangements for his elaborate mausoleum and the continuation of the dynasty could be ensured. This secrecy created an aura of mystery surrounding his final days, leaving contemporaries and future historians to speculate about the circumstances of his passing. Qin Shi Huang's death marked a turning point not only in his life but also for the empire he had unified. The emperor's immediate successor, his son Huai, was placed on the throne by court officials, who orchestrated the transition to avoid unrest. Yet the succession was not without intrigue. Powerful ministers manipulated events to maintain control over the young emperor, highlighting the fragility of authority even in a state previously dominated by absolute rule. The emperor's disappearance from public life, first by illness, then by death, underscored the limits of individual power in the face of mortality and human ambition. The secrecy surrounding Qin Shi Huang's death also had practical consequences. Orders for construction and administration continued, and provincial governors were unaware of the change in leadership. The emperor's monumental projects, such as the construction of roads, palaces, and fortifications, persisted, but without the guiding presence of their original architect. Rumors of the emperor's fate circulated among the populace, blending with folklore and superstition. This mix of myth and reality contributed to a historical legacy in which Qin Shi Huang's life, death, and ambitions became inseparable from legend. Immediately following his death, the Qin dynasty faced early signs of instability. The consolidation of the empire had relied heavily on Qin Shi Huang's personal authority, military prowess, and fearsome reputation. With his passing, discontent among laborers, soldiers, and provincial elites became more pronounced. Rebellions emerged, fueled by resentment over harsh labor conditions, high taxes, and the centralization of power. Within a few years, the Qin dynasty, despite its remarkable accomplishments, would collapse under internal pressures and external challenges. The emperor's vanishing thus became both literal, his death hidden from view, and symbolic, as the empire he had forged could not long survive without his commanding presence. The emperor's tomb, a monumental mausoleum designed to preserve his legacy for eternity, remains a testament to both ambition and secrecy. The terracotta army, countless artifacts, and underground passages illustrate the meticulous planning and resources devoted to ensuring a lasting memory. Yet, even in death, Qin Shi Huang could not control the unfolding of history. His tomb and the empire he built became sites of both reverence and reflection. reminding future generations of the impermanence of power, the consequences of ambition, and the human desire to defy mortality. Qin Shi Huang's story serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of authority, obsession, and mortality. While his administrative genius, military strategy, and unification of China were extraordinary, his relentless pursuit of immortality and imposition of harsh labor created vulnerabilities that surfaced immediately after his disappearance. The contrast between monumental achievement and the fragility of human life underscores a timeless lesson. No matter how vast or powerful a ruler may be, the inevitability of death and the limits of influence cannot be escaped. Even as historians examine Qin Shi Huang's life, achievements, and tomb with fascination, one enduring question remains. Can human ambition truly transcend mortality, or does every empire, no matter how meticulously constructed, eventually confront the inevitability of vanishing into history? From the windswept steppes to distant cities, Genghis Khan's armies moved with precision and terror, leaving behind a trail of conquest and questions about the price of empire. Once Temujin assumed the title of Genghis Khan in 1206, his focus shifted from unifying the Mongol tribes to expanding their influence across the vast expanse of Asia. He inherited an organized, disciplined army capable of remarkable mobility, but transforming this force into a tool for large-scale conquest required meticulous planning, intelligence, and adaptation. The Mongol armies operated on principles that balanced flexibility with strict discipline, emphasizing speed, communication, and psychological strategy. One of Genghis Khan's key innovations was the decimal organization of his army. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 enabled efficient command, rapid maneuvering, and adaptability on the battlefield. Leaders were selected based on merit, skill, and loyalty rather than noble birth, creating a professionalized and motivated military structure. This organization, combined with the mobility of horse-mounted troops, allowed small Mongol forces to defeat much larger armies through strategy, coordination, and the exploitation of terrain. The logistics of conquest were equally important. Genghis Khan ensured that supply lines were secure, scouts were deployed to gather intelligence, and communication networks often using mounted messengers allowed rapid transmission of orders. Cities and settlements targeted for conquest were often carefully studied in advance, with reconnaissance providing information on fortifications, troop numbers, and geography. Such preparation, while meticulous and boring in its attention to detail, proved decisive in campaigns that extended from northern China to Central Asia. Genghis Khan's expansion was not merely a series of battles, but a systematic campaign to integrate conquered territories into his growing empire. Administrative practices were introduced to maintain control over diverse populations. Local leaders who pledged loyalty were incorporated into governance structures, while dissenters faced strict consequences. Trade routes were monitored and secured, taxation systems standardized, and legal codes enforced across the empire. These measures ensured that conquest was not temporary, but formed the basis for a stable imperial structure. Yet, rapid expansion presented challenges. Loyalty among newly conquered peoples, the vast distances between territories, and the need for effective communication threatened the cohesion of the empire. Genghis Khan relied on a combination of fear, diplomacy, and incorporation of local elites to maintain order. Military governors were appointed to enforce laws, collect tribute, and oversee defense, while policies encouraging religious tolerance helped reduce resistance in culturally diverse regions. The careful balance between coercion and cooperation was essential to sustaining control over an empire that spanned thousands of miles. Genghis Khan's campaigns were often marked by psychological strategy as much as physical force. He employed fear and reputation to deter resistance, spreading accounts of past victories and ruthlessness to encourage surrender without fighting. Cities that surrendered voluntarily were often spared, while those that resisted faced overwhelming force. This strategic approach minimized unnecessary casualties among Mongol forces, allowing for continued mobility and effectiveness in future campaigns. Even as he expanded his empire, Genghis Khan remained deeply engaged in the details of governance and administration. Census-taking, standardized laws, and the appointment of trusted officials ensured that the conquered regions remained manageable. He also promoted trade and communication across the Silk Road, enhancing both economic stability and cultural exchange. These boring administrative details, often overlooked in stories of conquest, were crucial in transforming a collection of nomadic tribes into a structured and enduring empire. Yet, the relentless pace of expansion and the challenges of empire left one persistent uncertainty. Could a man who conquered so much truly control the diverse lands, peoples, and cultures under his rule? Or would the vastness of his empire eventually erode the authority that had brought him so much power? Even the unstoppable force of Genghis Khan could not escape the certainty of death. His disappearance remained shrouded in mystery, yet the empire he forged endured far beyond his lifetime. By the final years of his life, Genghis Khan had established the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. From the steppes of Mongolia to the frontiers of China and Central Asia, his conquests reshaped the political and cultural landscape. Even as he faced the physical challenges of aging, the demands of leadership, and the vast scale of his empire, Genghis Khan remained deeply involved in strategic planning, military campaigns, and administrative oversight. His relentless drive to unify and expand left little room for rest or reflection. Yet he continued to balance the immediate demands of conquest with long-term governance. The last military campaigns were marked by both audacity and careful calculation. Genghis Khan directed forces against resistant kingdoms, secured key trade routes, and enforced loyalty among recently subjugated territories. Mobility, intelligence, and discipline remained central to Mongol military strategy, while the emperor's presence inspired both awe and fear. These campaigns not only expanded the empire's borders, but also reinforced the cohesion and loyalty of the Mongol army, a critical factor for sustaining authority over such a vast region. Yet, even the mightiest leaders are mortal. Historical accounts suggest that Genghis Khan died in 1227, during or shortly after a campaign against the Western Jia dynasty. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, with various sources proposing illness, injury, or even assassination. The secrecy surrounding his passing was deliberate. The emperor's body was concealed to prevent enemies from learning of his death, and the location of his burial was kept hidden. This act reflects both the strategic acumen and the mystical sensibilities of Genghis Khan, who sought to ensure that even in death, his authority and legacy remained secure. Following his death, succession planning became crucial. Genghis Khan had appointed his sons, particularly Gaggai, as heirs, ensuring continuity of governance and military leadership. Advisors and generals acted to enforce stability during the transition, consolidating power and preventing immediate fragmentation. Despite these measures, the death of a central figure always carried risks for an empire as expansive as the Mongols. Internal rivalries, regional loyalties, and distant provinces could challenge cohesion, requiring careful management by the new leadership. The empire under Gaggai and subsequent descendants continued to grow, expanding into Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Genghis Khan's strategies, administrative systems, and military organization provided a durable framework for governance, trade, and cultural exchange. Roads, postal stations, and legal codes facilitated communication and commerce, illustrating the lasting impact of boring administrative details alongside spectacular conquests. Even decades after his death, the Mongol Empire remained a formidable and interconnected political entity, a testament to the structures and vision established by its founder. Yet, the legacy of Genghis Khan is not without complexity. While his conquests brought unprecedented integration of Eurasian lands, they also caused destruction, displacement, and social upheaval. Cities were razed, populations relocated, and traditional structures disrupted. The human cost of empire building was immense, a reality often overshadowed by tales of military genius and enduring monuments. Understanding the full impact of Genghis Khan requires acknowledgement of both achievement and devastation, reflecting the dual nature of power and human history. Even today, Genghis Khan's burial site remains undiscovered, symbolizing the mystery and enduring fascination surrounding his life and death. Archaeologists, historians, and local traditions hint at possible locations, yet the truth remains elusive. This deliberate disappearance reinforces the notion that, no matter how powerful a leader may be, mortality and historical uncertainty are inescapable. Genghis Khan, like so many rulers before and after him, ultimately vanished from the world he sought to dominate, leaving both tangible and intangible legacies that continue to shape history. Reflecting on the life and disappearance of Genghis Khan, one question persists: can even the most extraordinary conqueror control the course of history beyond death? Or does the inevitability of mortality ensure that every empire, no matter how vast, must eventually face its own vanishing?